The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke through the narrow streets of Hollow Point, Maine, a coastal town where the Atlantic crashed against jagged rocks with a violence that seemed almost personal. The year was 1852, and the nation stood on the precipice of something terrible. But there were those who understood that freedom, once compromised, becomes a contagion that spreads through every aspect of life, infecting even the most intimate moments with its poison. Elizabeth Crane was 23 years old on the morning she was supposed to marry Thomas Ashford, the son of the wealthiest shipbuilder in Hollow Point. She stood before the full-length mirror in her bedroom, a rare and expensive piece that her future father-in-law had imported from France as a wedding gift. The mirror was enormous, framed in ornate gold that pulsed darkly in the pre-dawn shadows. Elizabeth had not slept. She had spent the entire night staring at her reflection, watching as the candlelight played across the white silk of her wedding dress, creating shadows that seemed to move independently of her own movements. Her mother had died 3 years earlier, and her father, Captain Jonathan Crane, had become a different man in the wake of that loss. He had always been stern, a whaling captain who believed in discipline and order, but grief had transformed him into something harder, something more desperate. When Thomas Ashford had proposed, Captain Crane had accepted on Elizabeth's behalf without consulting her. The marriage would secure the family's financial future. The Cranes were old money, but old money in Hollow Point meant debts hidden beneath layers of pride and property that was mortgaged to men like William Ashford, Thomas's father. Elizabeth touched the mirror's surface with her fingertips, and the glass was cold, colder than it should have been. Her reflection stared back at her with eyes that seemed darker than her own, more knowing. She had tried to tell her father she did not love Thomas, that the thought of marrying him filled her with profound dread. But Captain Crane had been unmoved. He had said, "Love is a luxury, Elizabeth. Freedom is an illusion. We all have our duties, and yours is to this family." The words had echoed in her mind for weeks, growing louder and more insistent until they seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. Freedom is an illusion. But was it? Or was it simply something that had to be taken, seized with both hands, even if the cost was everything? She had met Thomas only a handful of times before the engagement was announced. He was handsome in a cold way, with pale eyes that never focused for long. He treated her with distant politeness, viewing their marriage as business. His father, William Ashford, was different. He was a large man with a booming voice and hands that gripped too tightly when he shook yours. He had a way of looking at Elizabeth that made her skin crawl, as if he were appraising livestock. The Ashford family fortune had been built on shipbuilding, but there were rumors in town about other sources of income, whispers about unlisted cargo, partnerships with plantation owners. In 1852, the Fugitive Slave Act was 2 years old, and it had turned the entire country into a hunting ground. Even in Maine, which had strong abolitionist sympathies, there were those who profited from the South's peculiar institution. The Ashfords, Elizabeth had begun to suspect, were among them. She had discovered this quite by accident 2 weeks before the wedding. She had been walking past her father's study when she heard voices inside. The door was slightly ajar, and she recognized William Ashford's booming laugh. What she heard froze her blood. "The shipment will arrive in Charleston by the end of the month," William was saying. "Iron shackles, manufactured right here in our own foundry. The plantation owners are paying premium prices, Jonathan. This war that's coming, whenever it comes, it's going to make men like us very rich." Her father responded quietly. "And the marriage, you're certain Thomas understands the importance?" "My son understands his duty," William had replied, "just as your daughter understands hers. Once married, our families unite. No one can touch us." Elizabeth fled, heart pounding. The marriage would make her complicit in unimaginable horrors. She would become part of a machine grinding humans into profit, and there would be no escape, no way to undo what would be done in her name. That night, standing before the French mirror, she had made her decision. She would not marry Thomas Ashford. She would not become a link in a chain that bound others. But how could she escape? Her father would never allow it. The Ashfords would never allow it. She had no money of her own, no family to flee to, nowhere to go. It was then that she had first noticed something strange about her reflection. The woman in the mirror was still her, still wearing the white wedding dress. But there was something different in her eyes, a hardness, a determination that Elizabeth herself did not quite feel. The reflection seemed to be watching her with an intensity that went beyond mere mirroring. It seemed to be thinking, calculating, planning. Elizabeth leaned closer to the glass. "What would you do?" she whispered to her reflection. "How would you escape?" The reflection's lips moved, forming words that Elizabeth could not hear, but somehow understood. "You already know what must be done. You've always known." The morning of the wedding arrived with a fog so thick it seemed to erase the world beyond the windows. Elizabeth's room was on the 3rd floor of the Crane House, a colonial-era mansion that overlooked the harbour. From her window, she could usually see the masts of ships and the grey expanse of the Atlantic beyond. But today, there was only whiteness, a blank canvas that seemed to promise either everything or nothing. Her aunt, her mother's sister, came to help her prepare. Aunt Margaret was a thin, nervous woman who had never married and lived in constant fear of becoming a burden on her relatives. She fussed over Elizabeth's hair and dress, chattering about the wedding ceremony and the reception that would follow. But her eyes kept darting to Elizabeth's face with a concern that suggested she saw something there that worried her. "You're so pale, dear," Margaret said, pinching Elizabeth's cheeks to bring some colour to them. "And you haven't eaten anything. You must keep your strength up. It's going to be a long day." Elizabeth said nothing. She had not spoken since the previous evening, when her father had come to her room to deliver what he called some final fatherly advice. He had told her that marriage was an arrangement, a contract that bound two families together for mutual benefit. Love, he said, was something that might come later, or it might not, but it was irrelevant to the essential function of the institution. Women, he said, had to understand their place in the world. They had to accept that their freedom was necessarily limited by their dependence on men, on fathers and husbands who knew better than they did what was in their best interests. Elizabeth had listened to this speech with a growing sense of unreality, as if she were watching herself from a great distance. When her father finally left, she had turned back to the mirror and found her reflection smiling at her, a cold smile that held no warmth, but a great deal of understanding. The church bells began to ring at 9 o'clock, their sound muffled by the fog but still insistent, calling the town to witness. The wedding was to take place at St. Michael's Episcopal Church, a white-clapboard building with a tall steeple that was the pride of Hollow Point's small but influential Anglican community. Elizabeth could hear the sounds of preparation downstairs, the servants moving quickly, her father's voice issuing orders. She remained in her room, standing before the mirror, watching her reflection watch her. "It's time," Aunt Margaret said from the doorway, her voice trembling slightly. "Elizabeth, dear, we must go. Everyone is waiting." Elizabeth turned away from the mirror slowly. She felt as if she were moving through water, every gesture requiring enormous effort. She followed her aunt down the stairs and out to the carriage that was waiting in the fog-shrouded street. Her father was already inside, dressed in his best black suit, his face a mask of stern satisfaction. This was his triumph, the marriage that would save the family fortune and secure their position among Hollow Point's elite. The ride to the church took only minutes, but to Elizabeth it seemed to last hours. The fog pressed against the carriage windows like something alive, something hungry. When they finally arrived, she could see shapes moving in the whiteness, people gathering despite the weather, drawn by the social spectacle of the season's most important wedding. The Ashfords had spared no expense. There were flowers imported from Boston, musicians hired from Portland, enough food and wine to feed half the town. Inside the church, the pews were filled with the faces of Hollow Point's most prominent families. Elizabeth recognized most of them. Merchants and ship captains, lawyers and landowners, all the people who had built their prosperity on the labor of others, whether those others were underpaid factory workers in the north or enslaved people in the south. They smiled at her as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, their faces eager and expectant, as if they were about to witness something wonderful rather than something monstrous. Thomas stood at the altar with Reverend Blackwood, a fat man whose sermons always emphasized obedience and submission to authority. Thomas looked even paler than usual, his blue eyes fixed on some point above Elizabeth's head, as if he could not quite bring himself to look at her directly. William Ashford stood in the front pew, his large frame barely contained by his expensive suit, his face red with pleasure and triumph. This was his victory as much as anyone's. Elizabeth reached the altar, and her father released her arm. Stepping back to take his place in the pew beside William, she stood next to Thomas, so close she could smell the cologne he wore, something expensive and cloying that made her stomach turn. Reverend Blackwood began to speak, his voice droning on about the sanctity of marriage, about duty and obligation, about the natural order of things in which men led and women followed, in which the strong guided the weak, in which freedom was something to be carefully controlled and rationed, lest it lead to chaos. Elizabeth felt something break inside her, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. She had spent weeks telling herself that she would find a way to escape, that some opportunity would present itself, that she would not have to go through with this. But now, standing at the altar with Thomas beside her and all of Hollow Point watching, she understood that there was no escape. The cage was closing around her, and once Reverend Blackwood pronounced them man and wife, the lock would turn, and she would be trapped forever. "Do you, Thomas Ashford, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Blackwood intoned. "I do," Thomas said, his voice flat and emotionless. "And do you, Elizabeth Crane, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Elizabeth opened her mouth, but no words came out. She stood frozen, paralyzed by the enormity of what was being asked of her. The church fell silent, every eye upon her. She could feel her father's rage building like a storm, could sense William Ashford's growing alarm. Thomas finally looked at her, his pale eyes narrowing with irritation. "Elizabeth," her father said sharply from the pew, "answer the Reverend." She tried to speak, tried to force the words out, but her throat had closed. She could not do it. She could not say the words that would seal her fate, that would make her part of the Ashford machinery of oppression and profit. She thought of the iron shackles being manufactured in William Ashford's foundry, thought of the human beings who would wear those shackles, thought of how her marriage would help finance that horror. She thought of her reflection in the mirror, of that cold smile, of the understanding in those dark eyes. "No," she whispered. The word fell into the silence like a stone into water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. Reverend Blackwood stared at her, his fat face confused. Thomas took a step back, his expression transforming from irritation to outrage. Her father half rose from his pew, his hand reaching out as if to grab her. But Elizabeth was already moving, already turning away from the altar, already walking back down the aisle toward the church doors. "Elizabeth!" her father roared. "Stop this instant!" She did not stop. She walked faster, her white dress trailing behind her, her veil slipping from her hair. Behind her she could hear chaos erupting, voices shouting, footsteps pounding. She reached the doors and pushed them open, stumbling out into the fog. She ran, not knowing where she was going, knowing only that she had to get away, had to escape while she still could. The fog swallowed her almost immediately. One moment she could hear the voices behind her, and the next there was only silence and whiteness. She ran through the streets of Hollow Point, her wedding dress becoming soaked and muddy, her carefully arranged hair coming loose and streaming behind her. She had no destination in mind, no plan, no idea what she would do next. She knew only that she would rather die free than live as a prisoner, no matter how gilded the cage. She found herself at the docks, where the fishing boats bobbed in the mist-shrouded water. The fog was even thicker here, so thick she could barely see her hand in front of her face. She walked to the end of a pier, her footsteps echoing on the wet wood, and stood looking out at the invisible ocean. Behind her, she could hear voices calling her name, could hear her father and Thomas and William Ashford, and half the town searching for her through the fog. But here, at the edge of the water, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She thought about her mother, who had died suddenly and mysteriously 3 years earlier. The doctors had called it a weak heart, but Elizabeth had always wondered, had her mother been happy? Had she felt trapped, as Elizabeth did now? Had she chosen her own escape? "Elizabeth Crane," a voice said from behind her, and she turned to find a woman standing there, a woman who looked exactly like her. It was her reflection from the mirror, somehow made flesh, wearing the same muddy white dress, the same haunted expression. But her eyes were different. Her eyes were knowing and cold and absolutely certain. "Who are you?" Elizabeth whispered. "I'm you," the reflection said. "The you that you're afraid to be. The you that knows what must be done." "I don't understand." "Yes, you do. You've always understood. Freedom isn't given, Elizabeth. It's taken. And sometimes the price is everything." Elizabeth stared at this impossible other self. The fog swirled around them both, and in the distance the voices continued calling her name, getting closer. She was running out of time. Soon they would find her. And when they did, her father would force her back to the church, would make her complete the ceremony, would lock the cage and throw away the key. "What are you suggesting?" Elizabeth asked. Her reflection smiled that cold smile. "You know what I'm suggesting. You've known since the moment you stood before that mirror and realized that you would rather cease to exist than live as they demand you live. Some cages can only be escaped one way." "I'm afraid," Elizabeth admitted. "Of course you are. But you're more afraid of what will happen if you go back, aren't you? You're more afraid of living as their possession than you are of not living at all." The voices were very close now. Elizabeth could see shapes moving in the fog, could hear her father calling her name with a fury that promised terrible punishment. She looked at her reflection, this impossible other self who stood before her with such certainty, and she understood that she was looking at a choice made manifest. She could go back, could submit, could spend the rest of her life as Elizabeth Ashford, wife of Thomas, daughter-in-law of William, complicit in their crimes, trapped in their world. Or she could choose something else, something final and irrevocable and absolutely free. She looked down at the dark water below the pier, invisible in the fog, but audible, lapping against the pilings with a patient, eternal rhythm. It would be cold, she knew. It would be quick. And it would be her choice, perhaps the only real choice she would ever have. "Elizabeth!" Her father's voice was very close now, maybe 30 feet away, maybe less. She looked at her reflection one last time. The other Elizabeth nodded, understanding and approval in her dark eyes. Then Elizabeth turned away from the fog, away from the voices, away from everything, and stepped off the pier into the cold Atlantic water. The shock of it drove the breath from her lungs. The water was far colder than she had imagined, cold enough to stop her heart. Her heavy wedding dress pulled her down immediately, the wet silk wrapping around her legs like chains. She tried to swim, some instinctive part of her fighting to survive, but the dress was too heavy and the water was too cold. She sank quickly, the light fading above her, the sounds of the world becoming muffled and distant. Her last thought was of freedom, of the simple fact that she had chosen this, that no one had forced her or commanded her or sold her into this. It was hers, this ending, and that made it not a tragedy, but a triumph, however small and bitter. But Elizabeth Crane did not die that day, though she wished she had. Her father, driven by rage and desperation, had followed the sound of the splash and dove into the water after her. He was a strong swimmer, hardened by years at sea, and he managed to grasp her dress and pull her up. Other men helped him drag her back onto the pier, where she lay coughing and choking, water streaming from her nose and mouth, alive when she had wanted so desperately to be dead. They carried her back to the Crane house and locked her in her room. A doctor was summoned, a thin man with cold hands who examined her and pronounced her suffering from hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis applied to any woman who refused to conform. He prescribed laudanum and complete bed rest and instructed Captain Crane to ensure that his daughter was never left alone. The wedding, it was decided, would be postponed but not cancelled. Elizabeth simply needed time to recover from her temporary madness. The marriage would proceed once she was in her right mind again. But Elizabeth was not recovering. She lay in her bed in a stupor induced by the laudanum, staring at the ceiling, seeing nothing, feeling nothing. The drug dulled her thoughts but could not erase them. She had tried to escape and failed. She had tried to choose death and been denied even that. There was no hope left, no possibility of freedom, no way out. Days passed, blurring together in a haze of forced medication and constant surveillance. Aunt Margaret sat with her during the day, trying to coax her to eat, to speak, to show some sign of life. At night, her father placed a guard outside her door, a brutish servant named Cutler, who had instructions to prevent Elizabeth from attempting any further foolishness. The only constant in her grey, drugged existence was the mirror. The servants had wanted to remove it, thinking that perhaps it contributed to Elizabeth's madness, but Captain Crane had refused. It was a gift from the Ashfords, he said, and to remove it would be an insult to the family that Elizabeth would soon join, whether she wished to or not. So the mirror remained, standing in the corner of her room, its gold frame gleaming dully in the lamplight, its surface reflecting back a version of Elizabeth that looked more and more like a corpse with each passing day. 3 weeks after her failed escape, Elizabeth woke in the middle of the night to find her reflection standing beside her bed, not in the mirror, but physically present, a solid figure dressed in the same nightgown that Elizabeth wore, with the same pale face and dark circled eyes. Elizabeth was so dulled by laudanum that she felt no fear, only a distant curiosity. "You're back," Elizabeth whispered. "I never left." Her reflection replied, "I've been waiting, watching, planning." "Planning what? There's no escape. I tried and failed." "You tried the wrong way. You tried to escape through death, but they wouldn't even allow you that. So we need to try something else, something they won't expect, something they can't prevent." "What are you talking about?" The reflection sat on the edge of the bed, so close that Elizabeth could have touched her, though she did not. "You think your only choices are submission or death. But there's a third option, one you haven't considered. You can give them what they think they want. You can go through with the marriage. You can become Elizabeth Ashford." "No," Elizabeth said, trying to summon anger but managing only exhaustion. "I won't. I'd rather die." "You're not listening. I said you can become Elizabeth Ashford, but I didn't say you had to be Elizabeth Ashford. Do you understand the difference?" Elizabeth stared at her reflection, trying to make sense of this through the fog of the laudanum. Slowly, Like dawn breaking, she began to understand. "You mean—" "I mean that if you can't escape the cage, you burn it down, from the inside. You marry Thomas Ashford. You become part of their family. You learn their secrets, find their weaknesses, discover exactly how their machine works. And then you destroy it. You use their own tools against them. You free yourself by freeing others." "I'm not strong enough," Elizabeth whispered. "I tried to die rather than face them. How can I possibly do what you're suggesting?" "Because you'll have help. You'll have me. I'm the part of you that doesn't break, the part that doesn't give up, the part that burns with a cold fire that never goes out. Let me in, Elizabeth. Let me help you. Together, we can do what needs to be done." Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling tears leak from beneath her lids. She was so tired, so broken, so defeated. The idea of continuing to fight seemed impossible, but the alternative was to remain as she was, a prisoner in her father's house, waiting to be delivered to her husband like a piece of property. At least if she did what her reflection suggested, she would have some purpose, some reason to keep existing. "How?" she asked. "How do I let you in?" "The same way you called me forth in the first place. You look in the mirror and you see not what you are, but what you could be, what you must be. You see the strength you didn't know you had, the ruthlessness you've always possessed but never acknowledged. You see the truth of yourself and you stop turning away from it." Elizabeth opened her eyes and looked at her reflection. This impossible other self who sat beside her bed, offering salvation through vengeance. In the dim lamplight, her reflection's eyes gleamed with an intensity that was almost frightening. But Elizabeth was beyond fear now. She had been broken and drugged and imprisoned, and she had nothing left to lose except her own despair. "Show me," she whispered. "Show me what I need to do." Her reflection smiled, and this time the smile was not cold but fierce, full of a terrible joy. She stood and held out her hand, and Elizabeth took it. The reflection's hand was solid and warm, as real as Elizabeth's own. Together they walked to the mirror, and Elizabeth looked at her own face staring back at her. But this time she did not see a victim. She did not see a prisoner. She saw a woman who had been pushed to the edge and had discovered something hard and sharp within herself, something that could cut through chains. "Say it," her reflection commanded. "Say what you are." "I am Elizabeth Crane," Elizabeth said slowly, "and I am free." The reflection's smile widened. "Again, say it like you mean it." "I am Elizabeth Crane," Elizabeth said, louder now, feeling something kindle inside her chest, some spark of life that the laudanum could not quite extinguish. "And I am free. Again, I am Elizabeth Crane," Elizabeth shouted, her voice cracking, tears streaming down her face. "And I am free. I am free. I am free." The door burst open and Cutler rushed in, alerted by her shouting. But Elizabeth was already moving, already grabbing the heavy brass candlestick from her bedside table and swinging it with all her strength. It caught Cutler on the side of the head, and he went down hard, blood streaming from his scalp. Elizabeth stood over him, breathing hard, the candlestick still clutched in her hand, feeling more alive than she had in weeks. "Good," her reflection said from the mirror. "That's a start." The wedding took place 4 weeks later, on a cold November morning when the first snow was falling over Hollow Point. Elizabeth stood at the altar beside Thomas Ashford and spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice. And this time she did not run. She said, "I do," when Reverend Blackwood asked if she took Thomas to be her lawfully wedded husband, and she did not hesitate or falter. When Thomas kissed her, she did not flinch. When William Ashford embraced her and called her daughter, she smiled and thanked him. Everyone remarked on how recovered she seemed, how radiant, how much like her old self. Her father was relieved and triumphant. The Ashfords were pleased. The town of Hollow Point celebrated with the promised feast and dancing, and the fog that had cursed the first attempted wedding stayed away, and the sun broke through the clouds as if to bless the union. But those who looked closely at the new Mrs. Ashford might have noticed something strange in her eyes, something cold and calculating that had not been there before. They might have seen the way she watched her new husband and father-in-law with an intensity that suggested not affection, but study, the way a hunter studies prey. They might have heard the edge beneath her pleasant words, the hardness beneath her gracious smiles. Elizabeth Crane had died on that pier 3 weeks earlier, drowned in the dark water and resurrected against her will. The woman who married Thomas Ashford was something else, someone else, a fusion of the broken girl who had tried to escape and the cold reflection who had shown her another way. She was Elizabeth Ashford now, wife and daughter-in-law, part of the machine she despised. But she was also something the Ashfords did not suspect and could not anticipate. She was a weapon, and she was aimed directly at their hearts. The wedding night was the first test. Thomas took her to the Ashford mansion, a massive estate on the edge of town that overlooked the ocean. It was even larger than the Crane house, filled with expensive furniture and artwork that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations. William Ashford gave them his blessing and retired to his own wing of the house, leaving the newlyweds alone. In the bedroom that Elizabeth would now share with her husband, there was another mirror, not as large as the French one, but still substantial. Thomas began to undress, his movements awkward and perfunctory, treating the act of consummation as one more duty to be performed. Elizabeth stood before the mirror and saw her reflection watching her with those cold, knowing eyes. "You can do this," her reflection seemed to say. "It's just another form of survival. You've already died once. This is nothing compared to that." Elizabeth turned to face Thomas, and she found that her reflection was right. This was nothing. Her body could be commanded to do what was necessary. Her mind could go somewhere else, somewhere cold and clean and untouchable. When Thomas finally fell asleep beside her, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling nothing except a distant satisfaction that she had passed this first trial. She was inside now, inside the Ashford fortress. Now the real work could begin. The weeks that followed established the pattern of Elizabeth's new life. She played the role of dutiful wife with skill that surprised even herself. She attended church services and social functions. She supervised the household staff. She made conversation with the other wives of Hollow Point's elite, learning who was connected to whom, which families had secrets, which men had weaknesses. She was charming and gracious and utterly conventional. Everything a woman of her station was expected to be. But in the early mornings and late evenings, when Thomas was at the shipyard and William was busy with his business dealings, Elizabeth explored. The Ashford mansion was full of locked doors and private spaces, and Elizabeth made it her mission to discover what lay behind them. She learned to pick locks using techniques she had read about in a book of criminal accounts she had found in Thomas's library. She memorized the servants' schedules and found times when she could move through the house unseen. What she discovered confirmed her worst suspicions. In William Ashford's study, hidden in a secret compartment behind a panel, she found ledgers that detailed every illegal transaction he had engaged in for the past decade, ships that had carried human cargo from Africa to Cuba and then smuggled enslaved people into the southern United States, iron shackles and chains sold to plantation owners at premium prices, loans made to slave traders and enforced with violence. The Ashford fortune was built not just on shipbuilding, but on human suffering, on bodies broken and lives destroyed for profit. Elizabeth copied the ledger entries carefully, writing in code on scraps of paper that she hid beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. She wrote letters to abolitionist organizations in Boston and New York, anonymous letters that hinted at evidence of illegal activities. She began to cultivate relationships with the servants, particularly with a young kitchen maid named Clara, whose family had escaped from slavery in Maryland 5 years earlier. Through Clara, Elizabeth made contact with the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and brave people who helped freedom seekers escape to Canada. Her reflection appeared to her often during these weeks, always in mirrors, always watching with those cold, approving eyes. Sometimes Elizabeth was not sure where she ended and her reflection began, whether the thoughts in her head were her own or something borrowed from that other self who lived in the glass. But it did not matter. What mattered was the work, the careful accumulation of evidence and connections that would eventually bring down the Ashford Empire. Thomas noticed nothing. He was not cruel to Elizabeth, but neither was he kind or particularly interested in her. She was his wife because that was what society expected, because their marriage served his father's purposes, but he had no real engagement with her as a person. He spent most of his time at the shipyard or in the private clubs, where Hollow Point's elite gathered to drink and discuss business. When he was home, he barely spoke to her, except to issue perfunctory instructions about household matters. William Ashford, however, was more observant. He had a way of watching Elizabeth when he thought she was not looking, his small eyes narrowed with calculation. He began to ask her questions about her family, about her father's business dealings, about connections she might have in other ports. Elizabeth answered carefully, revealing nothing of importance but always seeming cooperative and helpful. She understood that William saw her as an asset to be exploited, another tool in his machinery of profit. It was William who first mentioned the shipment that would arrive in 3 months' time, in early March. They were at dinner, the three of them gathered in the formal dining room with its elaborate chandeliers and painted ceiling. Thomas was barely paying attention, focused on his meal, but William was looking directly at Elizabeth when he spoke. "You'll need to attend a certain function in March," William said. "It will be late at night, after most of the town is asleep. Thomas will accompany you, as will I. It's important that you present well, that you understand your role as part of this family." "What sort of function?" Elizabeth asked, keeping her voice neutral and curious. "A business matter," William said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with the details of. Simply be prepared to dress well and behave appropriately. There will be certain guests, certain associates from the South. Your presence will help demonstrate that the Ashford family is respectable, well-connected, properly established." Elizabeth understood immediately what he was telling her. The shipment would not be iron and timber. It would be human beings, brought north in violation of international law, to be transported south to waiting plantations. The function would be the exchange, the transaction in which bodies were traded for money. And Elizabeth's role would be to stand there in her expensive dress and make it all seem normal and acceptable, to provide the veneer of civilization to an act of profound barbarism. "Of course," she said, smiling at William with what she hoped looked like wifely devotion. "I'll be honored to attend, whatever the family requires." William's smile widened. "Good girl. I knew you'd understand your place eventually. Your father trained you well, even if it took some encouragement to bring out your natural docility." Elizabeth said nothing, but later that night, standing before the bedroom mirror while Thomas snored in their bed, she met her reflection's eyes and saw the fury there, the cold rage that matched her own. They had 3 months to prepare, 3 months to ensure that when William's shipment arrived, it would not reach its intended destination. 3 months to strike a blow against the machine that had tried to grind her into compliance. 3 months. Her reflection whispered, so quietly that Elizabeth was not sure if she had heard it or thought it. Then we show them what freedom really means. Elizabeth spent those 3 months gathering every piece of information she could find about the planned shipment. She listened at doors and read private correspondence. She cultivated Clara's trust and through her made contact with a network of abolitionists who were willing to take considerable risks to disrupt the slave trade. She learned that the ship carrying the shipment was called the Prosperity, that it would arrive at a private dock owned by the Ashfords, that the transfer would take place under cover of darkness, with only a handful of trusted associates present. She also learned something more disturbing. Her father, Captain Jonathan Crane, would be one of those present. He had agreed to provide security for the transaction, to use his connections and reputation to ensure that no one interfered. The marriage had accomplished exactly what William and Jonathan had intended. It had bound their families together in a conspiracy of profit and oppression. The knowledge that her own father was complicit in this horror should have devastated Elizabeth, but she found that she felt nothing except a cold clarity. Whatever affection she had once felt for Jonathan Crane had died on that pier, drowned in the same water that had nearly claimed her life. He was no longer her father. He was simply another obstacle, another component of the machine that needed to be destroyed. She began to make more concrete plans. Working through Clara and the Underground Railroad network, she arranged for assistance on the night of the shipment. There would be armed men waiting in the darkness, men who had escaped slavery themselves and who had no hesitation about using violence to ensure that others could escape as well. There would be wagons ready to transport the captives to safety, to hiding places, and eventually to Canada. All Elizabeth needed to do was ensure that the captives could be freed from their chains before the transaction was completed. The keys to those chains, she learned, would be in William Ashford's possession. He never trusted anyone else with such critical details, which meant that Elizabeth would need to get those keys from him somehow in the midst of the chaos that was about to unfold. Her reflection had suggestions for how to accomplish this. "He watches you," the reflection said one night, speaking from the bedroom mirror while Thomas slept. "He looks at you the way men like him always look at women they think they own. Use that. Get close to him. Make him drop his guard. Then take what you need." "He's my father-in-law," Elizabeth said, feeling a twist of revulsion. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting you survive," her reflection interrupted. "I'm suggesting you use every tool at your disposal, every advantage, every weakness in your enemy's armor. You've already sacrificed so much. What's one more indignity compared to the freedom of dozens of human beings?" Elizabeth stared at her reflection, at this cold, ruthless version of herself who lived in the glass. She wanted to argue, to insist that there had to be another way, but she knew her reflection was right. William Ashford was their weak point. His arrogance and appetites were vulnerabilities that could be exploited. If getting close to him, if letting him think he had some power over her, would give her access to those keys, then that was what she would do. "I hate this," she whispered. "Good," her reflection replied. "Hate is useful. Hate burns clean. Hate gives you strength when everything else fails." The night of the shipment arrived in a cold rain that drummed against the windows of the Ashford mansion. Elizabeth dressed carefully, choosing a gown that William had once complimented, dark green silk that set off her pale skin and dark hair. Thomas was irritable and distracted, nervous about the night's work in a way that suggested he was not as comfortable with his father's business dealings as William believed. But he said nothing as they climbed into the carriage that would take them to the private dock. William was already there when they arrived, standing with several associates of the Ashford business. Her father was among them, looking older and harder, face set grimly. He glanced at Elizabeth without recognition. To him, she was Thomas Ashford's wife now. The Prosperity was a small, fast ship, the kind built for speed rather than cargo capacity. It sat low in the water, dark sails furled, deck barely visible. Lights showed in the hold, sounds muffled but unmistakable, the sound of chains, of people crying out in fear and desperation. William began to speak, his voice carrying over the rain. "Gentleman and lady," he said, nodding at Elizabeth, "tonight represents the culmination of considerable effort and investment. The cargo is prime, 23 individuals suitable for fieldwork or domestic service, all of them strong and healthy. The buyers are waiting in Charleston, and they've already paid half the purchase price. All we need to do is complete the transfer and arrange transport." One of the other men, a rough-looking character with a scar across his cheek, gestured toward the ship. "Let's get them offloaded, then. The longer we wait, the more chance of someone noticing." William nodded and pulled a ring of keys from his pocket. These were the keys Elizabeth needed, the keys that would unlock the chains that bound the captives below. She watched as William began to walk toward the Prosperity, and she knew that this was her moment. If she did not act now, if she allowed this transaction to proceed, she would be complicit in a way that no amount of future action could redeem. She stepped forward, intercepting William before he reached the ship's gangplank. "Father Ashford," she said, pitching her voice to carry over the rain, making it sound anxious and uncertain. "I'm afraid I'm not feeling well. The rocking of the dock, the smell of the water. I think I might faint." William turned to her, irritation flashing across his face. "Then go back to the carriage, girl. This is no place for weakness." "Please," Elizabeth said, swaying slightly, reaching out to grasp his arm. "Just a moment. Just let me steady myself." She pressed close to him, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body through his coat, close enough to smell the brandy on his breath. His irritation transformed into something else, something she had seen in his eyes before, but had tried to ignore. His free hand came up to steady her, gripping her waist in a way that was far too familiar, far too possessive. "There now," he said, his voice dropping to something that might have been intended as soothing but sounded predatory. "You'll be fine. Women aren't built for this kind of work. You should be home in your parlor, doing needlework or whatever it is you do." Elizabeth let herself lean against him, her fingers finding the pocket where he kept the keys. She could feel the cold metal through the fabric of his coat. "You're so strong," she murmured, hating herself for the words, hating him more. "I don't know what I'd do without your guidance." William's grip tightened on her waist, and for a horrible moment Elizabeth thought he was going to kiss her right there in front of Thomas and her father and all the others. But then there was a shout from the Prosperity, a cry of alarm that cut through the rain like a knife. "Fire!" someone screamed. "Fire in the hold!" William shoved Elizabeth away and ran toward the ship, the keys forgotten. Elizabeth stumbled, caught herself, and felt the cold weight of the keys in her hand. She had done it. While William had been distracted by his own appetites, she had picked his pocket, a skill she had learned from a book and practiced in secret for weeks. Smoke was beginning to pour from the Prosperity's hold, thick and black even through the rain. The men on the dock were shouting, running toward the ship with buckets. But the fire was spreading fast, impossibly fast, as if it had been deliberately set and fed with something flammable. Because it had been. Elizabeth had arranged it through her contacts in the Underground Railroad. While William and the others had been distracted by her performance, men had moved in the darkness on the far side of the dock, men who had boarded the Prosperity and started the fire that would cover the rescue. Chaos erupted. William was screaming orders, trying to organize a response, but the fire was already out of control. Thomas was frozen, staring at the burning ship in horror. Her father had drawn a pistol and was looking around wildly, searching for whoever had set the fire. And in the midst of this chaos, Elizabeth was moving, running through the rain toward the Prosperity, with the keys clutched in her hand. She reached the gangplank and climbed aboard, the heat from the fire driving back the cold of the rain. Below, in the hold, she could hear people screaming, could hear the rattle of chains. She found the hatch and pulled it open, smoke billowing up to choke her. She descended into hell, into a space packed with human beings shackled together, their faces streaked with tears and soot, their eyes wide with terror. "I have the keys!" Elizabeth shouted over the roar of the flames. "I'm going to free you! You have to trust me!" She began unlocking chains, her fingers clumsy with haste and fear. Behind her, she could hear footsteps on the deck above, could hear William's voice screaming her name. But she kept working, kept freeing people, kept moving down the line of captives. Strong hands reached out to help her, to take the keys and pass them along, to unlock their own shackles and those of their companions. The fire was spreading fast, too fast. The ship was going to sink or burn, or both, and everyone still aboard would die if they did not get off immediately. Elizabeth felt arms grab her, lifting her, carrying her back toward the hatch. She tried to protest, to insist that she needed to free everyone, but the smoke was choking her, and the heat was unbearable. She emerged onto the deck to find it crowded with freed captives, men and women, and even some children, all of them stumbling toward the gangplank through the smoke and flames. On the dock, William and the others had realized what was happening. Her father had his pistol raised and was aiming at the people streaming off the ship. William was screaming for the guards to stop them, to recapture them, to do whatever was necessary to prevent the cargo from escaping. But then there were other men emerging from the darkness, the armed abolitionists that Elizabeth had arranged to be waiting. They had rifles and pistols, and they were not hesitating to use them. A shot rang out, and one of William's guards went down. Another shot, and another. The dock erupted into a full battle, people running and shooting and dying in the cold rain. Elizabeth climbed down the gangplank, her legs shaking, her lungs burning from smoke inhalation. She saw Thomas standing paralyzed, his face a mask of shock. She saw her father taking aim at a fleeing woman and her child. She saw William pulling out a pistol of his own, saw him turning toward her with murder in his eyes. "You!" William snarled. "You did this, you ungrateful little bitch. You've destroyed everything." He raised the pistol, aiming directly at Elizabeth's heart. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself. She had succeeded in freeing the captives, but it looked like the cost would be her own life. She waited for the shot, oddly calm, thinking that perhaps this was always how it was going to end, that her death on the pier had merely been postponed, not prevented. But the shot, when it came, was not from William's pistol. Her father had fired, had shot William Ashford in the back, the bullet punching through his chest and sending him sprawling onto the wet dock. William tried to rise, blood pouring from his mouth, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. He looked at Jonathan Crane, at the man who had been his partner and co-conspirator, and he managed one word: "Why?" Jonathan Crane stood over William Ashford's dying body, the smoking pistol still in his hand. His face was streaked with rain and tears. "She's still my daughter," he said quietly. "God help me, she's still my daughter." Then he turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving William to die alone on the dock, while around them the battle raged and the Prosperity burned and sank into the cold Atlantic. Elizabeth stood frozen, unable to process what she had just witnessed. Her father had saved her life. Her father, who had sold her into marriage, who had conspired with the Ashfords to profit from slavery, who had been willing to shoot a fleeing woman and child, had chosen her over his partner at the critical moment. She did not know what it meant, could not understand what had motivated him, whether it was love or guilt, or simply some last vestige of human decency asserting itself at the crucial moment. Thomas was at her side suddenly, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "What have you done?" he hissed. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've freed them, Elizabeth said, meeting his eyes steadily. I've done what should have been done from the beginning. You've ruined us, Thomas said. The business, the family name, everything. When word of this gets out, Elizabeth interrupted, the world will know what the Ashfords really are, what you really are, slavers and criminals and murderers. And I have the evidence to prove it, Thomas. I have your father's ledgers. I have documentation of every illegal transaction, every shipment of human cargo, every dollar of blood money. I've already sent copies to the newspapers in Boston and New York. By tomorrow morning, the Ashford name will be destroyed. Thomas stared at her, his face going from red to white. You planned this, he whispered. All of it. From the beginning. Not from the beginning, Elizabeth said. From the moment I realized that I would rather die than live as your wife. From the moment I understood that freedom is not given, but taken. From the moment I chose to burn down the cage rather than die inside it. Thomas released her arm and stepped back, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. Around them, the shooting had stopped. The freed captives had fled into the night, guided by the abolitionists to safety. William Ashford was dead, his body lying in a spreading pool of blood and rainwater. The Prosperity was sinking, its masts disappearing beneath the waves, taking with it the last evidence of the Ashfords' crimes, except for the documentation that Elizabeth had carefully preserved and distributed. What happens now? Thomas asked, and there was something broken in his voice, something that might have been desperation or might have been something else. Now you have a choice, Elizabeth said. You can try to continue your father's work, try to rebuild what I've destroyed, and spend the rest of your life being hunted by the law and by everyone who knows what you've done. Or you can walk away. Sell what's left of the business, pay restitution to everyone you've harmed, and try to build something better from the ruins. And you? Thomas asked. What will you do? Elizabeth looked past him, toward the darkness where the freed captives had disappeared, toward a future that was suddenly open and uncertain and entirely her own. I'm leaving, she said. Tonight. I'm walking away from all of this, from you and your name and everything it represents. Our marriage is over, Thomas. I choose freedom over everything else, and that means freedom from you. She turned and began to walk away, her green silk dress ruined by rain and smoke, her hair hanging in wet tangles, her hands shaking from adrenaline and shock. She heard Thomas call after her once, but she did not look back. She walked off that dock and into the rain-soaked streets of Hollow Point, and with every step she felt lighter, freer, more alive. She did not go to the Crane house or the Ashford mansion. She went instead to Clara's small apartment above a bakery, where the young woman welcomed her without question and provided clean clothes and a place to sleep. In the morning, Elizabeth would leave Hollow Point forever. She would go to Boston or New York, would use the contacts she had made through the Underground Railroad to build a new life, would dedicate herself to the cause of abolition and justice. But that night, exhausted and traumatized and strangely exhilarated, she stood before the small mirror in Clara's bedroom and looked at her reflection. The woman who looked back at her was different from the terrified bride who had stood before the French mirror all those weeks ago. Her eyes were harder, more knowing. Her face showed the marks of what she had endured and what she had accomplished. She looked like someone who had died and been reborn, someone who had walked through fire and emerged transformed. We did it, her reflection said, and this time Elizabeth was certain that the words came not from the mirror, but from inside her own head, from that cold, ruthless part of herself that she had embraced out of necessity. We freed them. We destroyed the Ashfords. We took our freedom. At what cost? Elizabeth whispered. Does it matter? You're alive. You're free. And tomorrow you can start becoming whoever you want to be without anyone to command you or control you or sell you. Isn't that worth any price?" Elizabeth did not answer, because she did not know. She thought of William Ashford dying in the rain, of her father walking away into the darkness, of Thomas's broken voice asking what happened now. She thought of the freed captives fleeing into the night, given a chance at freedom because of what she had done. She thought of the cost and the benefit, the destruction and the creation, the death of oneself and the birth of another. She was no longer Elizabeth Crane and no longer Elizabeth Ashford. She was something new, something forged in desperation and rage and determination. She was a woman who had looked into the mirror and seen not what she was, but what she had to become. She was a woman who had chosen freedom, whatever the cost, whatever the consequences. The story of the bride of Hollow Point, who married her own reflection, spread through Maine like wildfire. The details varied depending on who told it. Some said she had gone mad and burned down the Ashford mansion with herself inside it. Others said she had killed William Ashford with her own hands and then vanished into the night, possibly drowned, possibly fled to some distant city. Still others, whispered only in certain circles, said she had freed dozens of enslaved people and destroyed one of the region's most prominent families in a single night of carefully planned chaos. The truth, as always, was more complicated, but the story persisted, taking on the quality of legend. They said that on foggy nights, you could sometimes see a woman in a white wedding dress standing at the end of the dock where the Prosperity had burned and sank. They said she was looking for her reflection, or perhaps for her soul, or perhaps for something else entirely. They said she was a ghost, a warning, a symbol of what happened when you tried to cage something that was meant to be free. Elizabeth heard these stories years later, when she was living in New York and working with the American Anti-Slavery Society. She heard them and smiled her cold smile, the one she had learned from her reflection all those years ago. Let them tell their stories, she thought. Let them create their legends. The truth was simpler and harder than any ghost story. The truth was that freedom was never free, that it always cost something, that sometimes the price was everything you thought you were. She had paid that price on a cold October night in 1852, and she had been paying it every day since. But she had also lived to see the Fugitive Slave Act challenged and eventually defeated. She had lived to see the Civil War begin and end, to see slavery abolished, to see the chains finally broken that had bound millions of people. She had lived to see freedom, real freedom, become something more than just a dream. And sometimes, late at night, she would stand before a mirror in whatever boarding house or apartment she currently occupied, and she would see her reflection watching her with those cold, knowing eyes. They would look at each other, the woman and her reflection, and they would understand that they were two parts of the same whole, that the girl who had tried to drown herself and the woman who had burned down an empire were both Elizabeth, both real, both necessary. Was it worth it? She would sometimes ask her reflection, and her reflection would always give the same answer. You're still here. You're still free. That's the only answer that matters. Elizabeth would nod and turn away from the mirror, and she would go on living, go on fighting, go on choosing freedom over everything else, whatever the cost. Because that was what her reflection had taught her. On that terrible night when she had looked into the glass and seen not what she was, but what she had to become, that freedom is not a gift, but a choice, that it must be taken and defended and fought for every single day. That was the true curse of Hollow Point, if curse was the right word. Not a ghost or a supernatural horror, but something far more terrifying and far more real. The knowledge that we are all complicit in the cages we build for ourselves and others, that true freedom requires us to destroy not just external chains, but the internal ones that bind us to comfort and complicity. that sometimes the only way to live free is to be willing to die for it, or to become something else entirely, something harder and colder and more ruthless than we ever imagined we could be. Elizabeth Crane carried that knowledge with her for the rest of her life, and whenever she looked in a mirror, she saw it reflected back at her in eyes that were both hers and not hers, familiar and strange, a reminder of the night she married her own reflection, and in doing so, freed not just herself, but everyone whose chains she had broken, whose lives she had saved, whose freedom she had purchased with the death of everything she had been before. That was the real story of the Bride of Hollow Point. Not a ghost story or a cautionary tale, but something more disturbing and more powerful, a story about what it costs to be free and whether that cost is one worth paying. Elizabeth had paid it, and she had lived with the consequences, and she had never once regretted her choice, because in the end the choice was simple, even if the consequences were not: to live free or die trying, to break the chains or become part of them, to look in the mirror and see not what you are but what you must become. Elizabeth had made her choice on that October morning in 1852, and she had lived with it and died with it and been reborn through it. And that, more than any ghost or supernatural curse, was the true horror and true triumph of her story. That she had been willing to become a monster to fight monsters, that she had been willing to marry her own darkest reflection and embrace everything it represented, because the alternative was worse than any nightmare. The Bride of Hollow Point who married her own reflection. That was how the legend went, and like all legends, it contained a truth that was more terrifying than any fiction. That we all have that reflection waiting in the mirror, that cold, ruthless version of ourselves that knows what must be done and is willing to do it. The only question is whether we have the courage or the desperation or the necessity to let that reflection out, to become what we must become in order to be free. Elizabeth had answered that question on a foggy morning in Maine, and she had spent the rest of her life living with the answer. And when she finally died, decades later, in a boarding house in New York, alone but never lonely, the last thing she saw before her eyes closed for the final time was her reflection in the mirror across from her bed, smiling that cold smile, offering that same understanding it had offered all those years ago. "You did well," her reflection seemed to say. "You lived free." And Elizabeth, dying but still herself, still both the broken girl and the ruthless woman, still the reflection and the reality, smiled back and whispered with her last breath, "Yes, I lived free." That was enough. That was everything. That was the only victory that mattered in the end.